Sports Live, and I'm Kendall Makhamati. Now, the South African men's and women's hockey teams have been hard in action over the last couple of days. In fact, they did their final over the weekend. Both respectively won their finals and won their tournaments. Now, I'm chatting to Fabian Gregory. He's out in Durban, in our Durban studio. This is the men's coach, the South African men's hockey coach. Congratulations, first up, Fabian, for a fantastic tournament.
Thanks very much, Kendall. Yeah, it was a really tough tournament.
Fabian, one of the things that a lot of people were looking forward to were the latter part of the tournament, your big matchups against Kenya, and then eventually when you actually got to beat Egypt in the final. Very good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I think just the general public out there was definitely looking forward to the weekend. In the men's section, we had a semi-final against Kenya, which was a bit of a humdinger, and we squeezed through on that one, and we played Egypt in the final, which was really challenging. And obviously not for the faint-hearted, because it was really to and fro, and fortunately for us, we came through with a good result at the end.
Right, now, a lot of people have been wanting me to ask you this question. The state of African hockey, considering that there are quite a few things that hinge on this little discussion that we're talking about. First up, across the world in all sorts of different sporting codes, continental qualification is good enough to get the top of the roost to the Olympics, right? However, in South Africa, and right here, the men's team came out top of the roost, beat everybody, beat the best of the best from the continent. However, SABC has said you're not going to the Olympics. Why is that?
I think SABC have a different view, and their view is that you have to go to the Olympics and be a medal contender. Unfortunately, the situation South African hockey finds ourselves in is that we're not a professional setup, and we don't have a sponsor as such. So it's really difficult when I always use the comparison, and I say that it's like comparing a normal VW Golf, comparing it with a Formula One car and saying that the Formula One car has to win, where you have an amateur setup and you're competing against a fully professional setup and you're expecting us to win. And that's just not going to happen until we have a full-time program and we have a sponsor in place and enables us to compete with the best in the world more regularly. Then by all means say that we can become a medal contender. I believe that the structures we have in place at school level and at club level and going further at university and at provincial level, we by all means can become a professional setup and compete for a medal in years to come. But at the moment, it's nearly impossible for us to compete with the nations in the top 6. Yes, we bring out a competitive level, as typical South Africans would do, but we're really going out there and saying we're going to be a medal contender, which we're not hiding to nothing if you look at it in that perspective. It's also unfair that the continental qualifier is seen as a weaker qualifier. And if I look across the world, we just had the Oceanic qualifier as well, where the scores were quite lopsided as well. And at the end of it, Australia won that qualifier. So I think it's a bit unfair saying to South Africa that you're not going to go because of African qualifier being perceived as a weaker qualifier. And if you look at the matches on the weekend, we scraped through a 2-1 win against Kenya. And then yesterday we played Egypt, where we were 1-0 down and then 2-1, and the boys showed a lot of character coming through that. And winning a really tight affair, and at the end of the day you crowned African champions and you win an Olympic berth, but then your Olympic committee say to you that you cannot go, which I think is totally unfair.
Well, here's a question for you then, with everything that you said, Fabian, just basically putting everything into a context. African hockey, relative and compared to the rest of the world, at what level is it? Because one could easily say, and you I think said it as well, you could qualify as champions of Africa, but be on a hiding to nothing the minute you arrive at the Olympics, because the level of hockey in Africa is not the same as the level of hockey in Europe, for example. Is that a fair comment?
Yes and no. I think it's a fair comment on the one side that there are probably 4 really competitive nations. And those are the semi-finalists on the weekend. And if you look at the closeness of the games, it shows how relatively competitive African hockey is. And it also shows the growth that is taking place in African hockey. And then from a growth perspective, you also see now that we had 2 new teams at this event. We had Botswana competing for the very first time, and also had Tanzania competing for the very first time. So it shows that there's growth in African hockey. And if you're competing for the first time against nations like South Africa and Egypt, who've been playing for decades already, then it makes it really difficult, and that's where the scores were a bit lopsided, and you find the competitive nature or the games not being as competitive as you might have liked. Compare this to Europe, where most of the teams in Europe are fully professional. And it's also the distance. So you're looking at countries, Holland and Germany, where it's probably 50 to 60 Ks, and they're able to play a test match. Belgium, on the other hand, is just next door as well. So it makes it really easy for them to compete. And you look at Africa, for us to play test matches against Egypt, we pretty much only play them twice every 2 years. And that's only at a qualifier, and the qualifier is usually for an Olympic berth or
Fabian?
a World Cup berth, which makes it really difficult.
Fabian, I hear you, and I'm about to run out of time, but I think it's very important that we get this from you. Where to now? Because from what I'm understanding, what's missing is the professionalization of South African hockey. Once we get there, we get them into programs, and that's what they're doing full time. Where to now? How do we get to that point, and how soon do we get to that point?
I think it's critical for us that we find a backer and we find a sponsor that's going to help us go forward and make sure that we are able to compete with the rest of the world. And I believe that with the players that we have and the caliber of players that we have, we definitely can compete, but we do need a backer that's going to invest in us and say, hey, I believe that this team, and I'm going to get my money's value from a sponsorship and a marketing perspective, that these players are going to market my company, and that will enable us to compete at a higher level. And for sure, I believe that we have the ability and the infrastructure to get us into a top 8 position. If I'm realistic, I believe that we can end in the top 8, or at least 8th position at the next Olympics. That is even with a limited program.
Fabian, thank you very much. Very good stuff. We really do appreciate your time. Once again, fantastic stuff, beating the best of the best from Africa and topping the continental roost. And we wish you better luck next time. And once again, to all of our viewers, they need help. If you're a sponsor, you know how to get them. You make sure that you give them the money they need to professionalize themselves and get to the top 8 by the next Olympics.